Your clients are not struggling because your course content is bad. They're struggling because they can't connect it to the things they already know. I'm Dr. Catrina Mitchum, and I've been designing and redesigning courses online since 2009. People don't come to you from zero, right? Everyone that comes to your course is coming with previous knowledge, with previous skills, with previous ability, with previous learning baggage. And that's about learning in general, but also about the specific thing that you're trying to teach them. And what that is a schema. And so a schema is a framework that we come into a situation with when we want to learn more about it. And this framework is what we already know and do in relation to that topic. And learning happens when we connect the new stuff to the stuff that we already know. And so not everybody comes in with the same schema. And so they're going to be connecting things in different ways. For example, I have a specific schema for restaurants in the US, right? For me, that includes expectations about the menu, about servers, about ordering, paying, tipping, right? These are all things that I have a schema for based on different types of restaurants in the United States. When I go to a new restaurant, I don't relearn how restaurants in the US work. I use the existing information, the existing framework that I have to know how to navigate that situation. And that means any new information that I get, I am mapping on to what I already know. But the first time that I went to a restaurant that didn't give us a menu and there was a QR code on the table, it wasn't marked or anything, I didn't know what to do. My schema did not have that as part of what to expect at a restaurant. So of course we were told, and I added that piece, right? Menu. Sometimes it's going to be a QR code at the table. I've added that to my restaurant schema. And that's exactly what happens in your course, right? People come in with some schema, they have some things that they know, but not necessarily all of the pieces. And that matters because learning doesn't happen in a vacuum. And your job when you're trying to teach someone is to help them make the connections so that they can learn how to do the thing. That connection, that hanging new information on old information is one of the ways that we take information and encode it so that we can use that information to do other things after the course is over. Remembering information becomes harder when we don't make that connection. And if that information is bouncing off and we're not remembering it, then we're going to run into problems of learners not being able to do the things that they came to us to be able to do. Okay, so we're going to run through a couple of examples. So what happens when you don't help them make connections? Example one is going to be around teaching learning objectives because that is what I know best. So I might say a learning objective is a statement that describes what learners will be able to do. A student that doesn't have any teaching background might say, okay, well, what does that mean, right? They don't have a connection point. It's just kind of information that's floating around. They might memorize that definition, but they can't use it. Example two, if you were teaching someone how to create an email nurture sequence, you might say a nurture sequence builds a relationship over time through strategic touch points. A student that's never done email marketing or watched an email marketing video might say something like, what the heck is a strategic touch point? I don't want to be touching potential clients because they don't have connections to things that they already know, right? It feels like jargon and it's not helpful. So what happens when you do help them make connections? In our first example about teaching learning objectives, if we said instead, remember when you learned to ride a bike? Someone didn't just tell you about bikes. They helped you learn how to do it. That, riding the bike, is an outcome. Or something like a learning objective is just writing down what someone will be able to do after your lesson. For example, ride a bike around the block instead of understand how bikes work. So here we are making a connection between a common experience, right? So that they can see and feel and remember the difference between knowing about something and doing it. So the new concept of a learning objective connects to knowledge they likely already have, which is learning how to ride a bike. Okay, so if we're going to go back to the second example where we're teaching an email nurture sequence, you might say, think about how you became friends with someone. You didn't meet once and immediately become best friends, right? You had coffee, then texted a few times, hung out, and slowly built trust. That is what a nurture sequence does, but with email. It builds relationships over time through regular contact. So here, the connection is being made because they understand friendship building. They know what it was like to build a friendship and how hard it is when you become an adult. So we are taking the new concept of nurture sequences and mapping it onto the existing experience of making friends. Okay, so that's fine and dandy, but how do we actually design for this in our courses? First is identifying the things that are related that they probably already know. So you want to know what similar experiences have they already had. That can come from your market research if you've been doing it right. It can also come from just asking. It can also come from kind of shared experiences, right? Like the riding the bike one, like making friends. So they might not know learning objective, but they will inherently know the difference between theory and practice. They might not know nurture sequences, but they will know how relationships build. And your job is to find that bridge so that you can explicitly make the connection. You don't want to assume that they are going to make the leap themselves. You need to build that bridge. You can say things out loud like, this is like X that you already know. So I could say something like, a course map is like a recipe. They both show the steps to getting a result. Or chunking is like eating a meal. You don't shove the whole plate in your mouth at once. 3, you want to make sure that you are using analogies from their world and not just yours. So don't use kind of expert comparisons that just you understand because you know the area that you're trying to teach really, really well. Use everyday experiences that everyone has. These are things like cooking, maybe driving, making friends, being on social media, following directions. One of my favorite examples that I used in a developmental writing class that I used to teach was in order to teach audience awareness. I had students, this is back when you were charged for every text message that you sent, and it had to be 140 characters. So if you're not that old, hang in there with me. I asked them to give the same information in a text to 3 different people they knew. They needed to write a text for their professor, a guardian, and their closest friend. The information they were conveying in this text was that they were in an ambulance on the way to the hospital. And in 140 characters or less, they had to convey what was most important to those 3 audiences, right? Everybody was texting in 2008 and had the same limitations. So the more universal that connection point is, the more people can grab onto it to map the new stuff onto. So 4 is that you do want to start with those familiar things and then introduce the new. So your structure might be something like, you already know how to send a text message. This new thing is similar, but, and then give the caveat or the way that it is different. So you might say something like, you already know how to have a conversation with a client. Teaching is like that conversation, but asynchronous. They're not there to ask questions in the moment, so you have to anticipate what they're going to need. 5, you want to build those bridges. I know I've been talking about bridges a lot, but you need to build them in the actual course itself. So in your writing or your script or whatever it is, you might say something like, before I explain XYZ, think about a time and then paint the picture of the scenario that they'll be able to connect to. In your worksheet, you might say something like, how is this similar to something you already do or have already done? So don't just present new information. You want to make sure that you're giving the opportunity for them to connect to things that they already know and do, because that is going to help them move forward with the doing of the thing. Okay, now I'm going to give you some real examples from my course. I teach backwards design as part of my process, and I don't start with backwards design is a framework where you start with desired outcomes. I talk about it in terms of maps. So, have you ever planned a trip? You don't usually plan a trip without knowing where you're at least going first. Figure out where you're going to go and then plan how you're going to get there. That's kind of like backwards design. We want to start with where we're going and then plan the path. A second concept is I teach about cognitive load. I'm not going to say something like cognitive load theory explains working memory capacity limitations, right? First of all, I sound like a pompous ass. Secondly, you're not going to know what that means. Instead, I would say something like, have you ever tried to remember someone's phone number while someone else is talking to you? Yes, I understand we don't need to remember phone numbers anymore, but maybe it was a credit card number or an expiration date or a code that you had to put in when you're doing your second factor authentication. If someone's talking to you or you're distracted, you lose it, right? You can't remember the number. That's because your brain can only hold so much at one time. And when we dump too much onto our clients in our courses, they lose it. So the pattern here is that we start with a familiar experience, right? Planning trips, remembering numbers. Then we map the new concept and then make this explicit connection, but how it's a little bit different. So some common mistakes. Number one is assuming that they will make the connection. So that last piece of, okay, this is how it's the same but different is really, really important. You know how X is related to Y because you are the expert, but they're new to this. Mistake two, using expert analogies, right? Like I don't say things to you like, it's like Bloom's taxonomy. You don't know what the heck that is unless you're a former teacher. Instead, using analogies that are from everyday life. Mistake three is starting with a new concept and then trying to kind of map on to the old information later. So you don't want to lead with the jargon and try to explain it. You want to lead with something they know and then introduce the new thing. Mistake four is that it's kind of a one and done. So you don't just make the connection once and then that's it. You keep coming back to it. You keep reinforcing it. Remember, this is like X that we talked about. So you help strengthen those kinds of things through repetition. So why the heck does this matter in creating your course? So when clients can connect the new information to things that already live in their heads, they are more likely to remember the information that you're giving them. And that's important because it reduces cognitive load, which we've already talked about. It moves things into the long-term memory, which we've also already talked about. It makes it easier to apply things because we know that the doing is the important part of being able to apply it in other places and spaces. That is how we know they actually got what they came for. And so making those connections helps support all of those other pieces. And this is exactly the kind of thing and the kind of way that I teach in my membership. If you're interested, the link is in the description. So this video talked a lot about making connections to previous knowledge. What I haven't talked about yet is not everybody comes with the same knowledge, even if you're trying to pull from common experiences. In next week's video, we're going to cover how to decide who you're designing for and how to handle different starting points. If it's not there, it'll be there next week.